"You'll birth me 5 sons by spring with that body," the virgin mountain man declared to the obese Amish girl, and the whole barn fell silent. No one ever dared claim her before. She'd lived with whispers, with shame, with the weight of ridicule. But this wild stranger, scarred by the mountains, desperate for a family, threw down a vow in front of her entire church. At first, it seemed like madness, until her father saw salvation, and she saw the faint spark of a life where she might finally be wanted. But behind the hymn-singing and supper tables, danger stalks the valley. Railroad men ride with torches, deputies rattle jail keys, and this rough mountain man carries a temper that could destroy them both. Yet hidden in her mother's old Bible lies a secret that could change everything, if she dares to reveal it. Is this bold vow the start of love and redemption, or the spark that burns their world to the ground? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The winter wind whistled through the cracks of the newly raised barn's wooden walls. Lantern light cast long shadows across rough-hewn beams as the Amish families of the Colorado Highlands worked together, their breath visible in the cold air. The scent of fresh-cut pine mingled with wood smoke from the outdoor cooking fires, where women tended steaming pots of stew and baked goods cooled on makeshift tables. Hulda Yoder moved carefully between the crowded tables, balancing 3 fresh-baked pies in her strong arms. Her plain black dress stretched across her ample frame, and her white prayer covering was slightly askew from her work in the kitchen. Though her steps were sure, she couldn't help but notice the whispers and sideways glances from the young men gathered near the barn's entrance. "Watch your step, Big Hulda," one of the boys called out, earning snickers from his friends. "Don't want them pies meeting the floor." Hulda's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes downcast and focused on her task. At 23, she had grown accustomed to such remarks, though they still stung. Her father had long since given up hope of finding her a match, and she had resigned herself to a life of service to her family and community. Still, she took pride in her work. Her apple pies were the best in the settlement, and she had risen before dawn to ensure they would be perfect for the barn-raising celebration. The heavy wooden doors suddenly swung wide, letting in a blast of frigid mountain air that set the lanterns swaying. Snow swirled around the massive figure that filled the doorway, a man unlike any Hulda had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as an ox yoke. A thick beard, flecked with gray despite his relative youth, covered his lower face, and his buckskin clothing was dusted with snow. The conversations in the barn died away as Marco Kruger stepped inside. His boots, wrapped in crude leather strips against the cold, made no sound on the straw-covered floor. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, swept the room once before settling on Hulda, with an intensity that made her want to shrink into herself. She knew of him, of course. Everyone in the Highlands knew of Marco Kruger, the mountain man who lived alone in the high country, trading furs in spring and fall, but otherwise avoiding all company. Some said he had killed a man in his youth. Others whispered that he had been raised by bears. All agreed that he was dangerous. The silence in the barn grew thick as honey in winter as Marco strode forward. Hulda stood frozen, her arms beginning to tremble under the weight of the pies. The mountain man stopped barely an arm's length away, close enough that she could smell the pine sap and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. His voice when it came was like thunder rolling off the mountains. "You'll birth me 5 sons by spring with that body." The pies slipped from Hulda's nerveless fingers, landing with soft thuds in the scattered straw. A collective gasp rose from the gathered families, followed by a silence so complete that the crackle of the distant cooking fires seemed loud as gunshots. Hulda's father, Samuel Yoder, stood near the barn's center post, his lined face a mask of disbelief. Years of watching his daughter passed over by suitor after suitor had worn him down, left him looking older than his 55 years. Now he simply stared, his mouth working soundlessly as he tried to process the mountain man's shocking declaration. The room began to spin around Hulda. Blood rushed in her ears and dark spots danced at the edges of her vision. She was dimly aware of whispers starting up again, of her younger sister Rachel's voice calling her name in alarm. Then her knees buckled and the world went dark. "Hulda!" Several voices called out at once as she crumpled toward the floor. But before any of her family could reach her, Marco's massive hands shot out, catching her before she could strike the ground. He held her as easily as a child's ragdoll, her substantial weight seeming to trouble him not at all. "Stand back," he growled as Hulda's brothers rushed forward. They halted, uncertain, looking to their father for guidance. Samuel Yoder took a hesitant step forward, his weathered hands clenched at his sides. "Now see here, Kruger," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "You can't just come in here and—" "I can." Marco cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. "And I have." He looked down at Hulda's unconscious face, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "She's strong. Good hips. Kind eyes. She'll do well in the high country Khmer." Rachel Yoder, 2 years younger than Hulda and as slight as her sister was substantial, pushed through the crowd. "You can't take her. She's not some animal to be claimed." Her voice cracked with emotion, but she stood her ground even when Marco's fierce gaze fell upon her. "Ain't claiming her like an animal," he rumbled, "offering marriage proper and before witnesses." His eyes swept the crowd again, challenging anyone to dispute his words. "I've watched her. 3 months now coming down from my cabin. Seen how she works. How she carries herself. How she treats them that treat her poorly." This last was said with a pointed look at the young men who had been mocking Hulda earlier. The bishop of the community, Jacob Stoltzfus, stepped forward then. His gray beard nearly reached his chest, and his quiet authority drew all eyes. "This is not our way, Marco Kruger. We have traditions. Proper forms of courtship. You cannot simply demand—" "Your traditions," Marco interrupted again, though with slightly more respect than he'd shown Samuel Yoder, "have left this woman unwed and unhappy. I aim to change that." He shifted Hulda in his arms, cradling her more securely against his chest. "I've built a good cabin, 2 rooms tight against the wind, smokehouse full of venison and bear meat, root cellar stocked for winter, good land for a garden come spring." A low murmur ran through the crowd. These were not small accomplishments in the harsh mountain territory, and even those most shocked by Marco's behavior had to acknowledge the practical appeal of such provisions. Sarah Bontrigger, one of the older women in the community, stepped forward to check on Hulda. Her lined face showed concern as she felt the girl's forehead and checked her breathing. "She's just fainted from shock," she announced. "Let's get her somewhere quiet to recover." "I'll take her," Marco stated, but Sarah placed a restraining hand on his arm, the first person to dare touch him since he'd entered the barn. "You will not," she said firmly. "You've caused enough upset for one evening. Let her family care for her." Something in her steady gaze must have reached him, for after a long moment, Marco gave a sharp nod. Samuel Yoder and Hulda's brothers came forward with a bench, and Marco laid her on it with surprising gentleness. As her family gathered around her, Sarah Bontrager began fanning Hulda's face with her apron while Rachel chafed her sister's cold hands. "I'll return tomorrow," Marco announced to the room at large, though his eyes remained fixed on Hulda's pale face. "When she's awake to hear my proposal proper." Without another word, he turned and strode back to the doors, his movement making the lantern flames dance. He paused at the threshold, snow swirling around his large frame. Looking back over his shoulder, he added in a voice like distant thunder, "Them pies smell good." Then he was gone into the winter night, leaving behind a barn full of stunned faces and scattered whispers. Hulda stirred slightly on the bench, her eyelids fluttering. Rachel squeezed her hand tightly, while their father moved to stand between his daughter and the door, as if expecting Marco to return at any moment. The bishop conferred quietly with several other church elders, their expressions grave. The snow continued to fall outside, and the wind sang through the gaps in the barn walls. The 3 fallen pies lay forgotten in the straw, their perfectly crimped crusts broken, their sweet apple filling seeping into the golden stalks. Like the peaceful routine of the barn-raising celebration, they were a reminder of how quickly the ordinary could be transformed into the extraordinary, of how a single moment could upend a life as surely as a winter storm could change a familiar landscape. The lantern light flickered across the faces of the gathered families, each person trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. but no one moved to resume the celebration. Instead, they waited, watching as Hulda slowly returned to consciousness, knowing that tomorrow would bring either the beginning or the end of something none of them could yet fully comprehend. Hulda's eyes fluttered open to the soft glow of a lantern. She lay on a straw mattress in one of the barn's storage rooms, the familiar scent of hay and leather filling her nostrils. Her mother, Hannah, sat beside her, dabbing her forehead with a cool cloth. "There now, my daughter," Hannah murmured, her gentle voice a balm to Hulda's confused thoughts. "Take your time." The events of earlier came rushing back. The mountain man's declaration, the dropped pies, the darkness that had claimed her. Heat flooded Hulda's cheeks as shame washed over her. "Ma'am, did that really happen?" "Yum, it did." Hannah's weathered face showed concern, but there was something else in her eyes, a glimmer of consideration that made Hulda's heart skip. Beyond the thin wooden walls, heavy footsteps paced back and forth. Hulda recognized her father's distinctive gait, the slight drag of his left foot from an old injury. But there were other sounds too, deeper voices speaking in harsh whispers, and further away the unmistakable sound of Marco Kruger's rumbling responses. "He's still here?" Hulda whispered, pulling her quilt higher. Hannah nodded. "Outside in the yard, the elders are speaking with him now." She paused, smoothing Hulda's dark hair back from her face. "He refuses to leave until he's spoken with you properly." Through the walls, Elder Matthias Stoltzfus's stern voice carried clearly. "You have insulted our ways, Englisher. Such behavior has no place among God's people." "Meant no insult," Marco's deep voice replied, unrepentant. "Spoke what was in my heart. Where I come from, that's honest dealing." "Honest?" another elder scoffed. "You burst into our gathering, frightened our women, and made improper declarations about a maiden's physical attributes." "Spoke truth," Marco insisted. "Your girl's strong, built right for the mountains. Got kind eyes that show a gentle spirit. What's improper about seeing worth where others don't?" Hulda's breath caught at his words, her hands, work-roughened and larger than most women's, twisted in the quilt. Never had anyone spoken of her size as anything but a burden, a shame to be borne. Yet this stranger had looked at her and seen strength. The door creaked open and Samuel Yoder stepped inside. His familiar face was drawn with worry, but there was a thoughtful set to his mouth that Hulda recognized. The same expression he wore when considering a difficult trade or a complex problem. "How do you feel, daughter?" he asked quietly. "I'm well, Dad," Hulda replied, sitting up straighter, just overwhelmed. Samuel nodded slowly. "The mountain man, Kruger, he speaks of marriage. Says he's watched our family these 3 months past, seen how you work." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "He has a home built, good provisions laid in. Speaks of wanting sons, a family." Hannah's hand found Hulda's and squeezed gently. They both knew what Samuel wasn't saying, that at 23, Hulda's chances for marriage had seemed increasingly remote, that the whispers and jokes about her size had worn down her spirit year by year, that her father's greatest worry was what would become of her after he and Hannah were gone. "I would hear what he has to say," Samuel continued, if you're willing." Hulda's heart thundered in her chest. Part of her wanted to hide, to shrink away from the attention and scandal. But another part, a part that had nearly given up hope of ever having her own home, her own family, stirred to life. "I will listen," she said softly. The evening meal that followed was unlike any in Hulda's memory. The long trestle tables had been cleared of the barn-raising feast, but Sarah Bontrager had insisted on setting out a proper supper. Marco sat across from Hulda, his massive frame making the simple bench creak. His dark eyes never left her face, though he struggled visibly with the unfamiliar customs. When Bishop Stoltzfus began the prayer in German, Marco's hands remained on the table until Samuel quietly demonstrated how to fold them. The mountain man's fingers, scarred and rough from years of trapping, laced together awkwardly. His head bowed, but his eyes kept darting up to watch Hulda. The meal passed in tense silence, broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls. Hulda could feel the weight of the community's stares, the mixture of scandal and curiosity in their glances. Her appetite, usually healthy, deserted her entirely. Finally, as the dishes were being cleared, Marco spoke. "Need to know your answer, girl. Will you be my wife?" The direct question asked in front of everyone made Hulda's cheeks flame again, but something in her, some well of strength she hadn't known she possessed, made her lift her chin and meet his gaze. "If I consider your proposal," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "it must be done properly, according to our ways." A murmur of approval ran through the watching crowd. Elder Stoltzfus nodded encouragingly. "What ways?" Marco asked, his brow furrowing. "Courtship," Hulda explained. "No touching, no being alone together. Only singing hymns and sharing family meals, getting to know each other as God intends." Marco's massive hands clenched on the table. "How long?" "As long as it takes to be sure of God's will in this matter," Hulda replied, amazed at her own boldness. "I won't be rushed or shamed into marriage, even by a man who speaks of my strength." The last word came out barely above a whisper, but Marco's expression changed. Something like respect flickered in his dark eyes. "Never had family," he said gruffly. "Never sat to proper meals or sang hymns. But if that's your condition—" He straightened his shoulders, looking around at the assembled community. "I'll learn your ways, do things proper." The declaration brought another round of murmurs, these ones surprised and somewhat approving. Elder Stoltzfus stroked his beard thoughtfully, while Sarah Bontrager nodded in satisfaction. "Then I will consider your proposal," Hulda said, "and pray for guidance." Later that night, in the quiet of her small bedroom, Hulda knelt beside her narrow bed. The familiar posture of prayer brought comfort, but her thoughts were in turmoil. Shame still burned when she remembered fainting in front of everyone, remembered Marco's bold words about her body. Yet underneath that shame, a tiny flame of hope flickered. "Lord," she whispered, "is this your way of showing me I'm not forgotten? That even someone like me might have a home, a family?" Her fingers worried at the edge of her quilt. "Or is this a test? Guide me, Father, show me your will." The moonlight painted silver patterns on her floor through the window. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a reminder of the wild lands where Marco made his home. Hulda closed her eyes, torn between lifetime habits of proper behavior and the unprecedented possibility this day had brought. She thought of Marco's words about her strength, about his willingness to submit to Amish courtship customs despite his obvious discomfort with constraint. Perhaps, she reflected, God worked in ways that sometimes shocked and surprised even his most faithful followers. Rising from her knees, Hulda prepared for bed with her usual care, hanging her plain dress precisely, pinning her prayer covering in its accustomed place. But as she lay down, her hands moved unconsciously to rest on her middle, the body that had brought her so much shame now seen through different eyes. Strong, Marco had called her, built right for the mountains. Sleep was long in coming, but for the first time in years, Hulda's prayers were not solely focused on acceptance of God's will in her spinsterhood. Instead, she found herself asking for wisdom to recognize his plan, even when it arrived in unexpected ways. The winter sunrise painted the Colorado sky in shades of pearl and gold as Marco strode toward the half-finished barn. His breath frosted in the crisp morning air, and snow crunched beneath his heavy boots. Already the Amish men were gathering, their black coats stark against the whiteness. Samuel Yoder looked up from examining a stack of lumber. "Got morning," he offered cautiously. Marco nodded, shrugging off his bearskin coat. Without a word, he grabbed the two-man saw propped against a beam. "Who will work with me?" The men exchanged glances. Finally, young Jacob Stoltzfus stepped forward, though his face showed clear apprehension at partnering with the mountain man. They positioned the first log, and Marco took the lead position. His massive hands gripped the saw handles, muscles bunching beneath his wool shirt. At his nod, they began to pull the saw back and forth through the timber. The blade sang through the wood with surprising speed. Marco's powerful strokes forced Jacob to quicken his pace, and soon sweat gleamed on both their brows despite the cold. When the log split, the clean cut drew appreciative murmurs from the watching men. "Another," Marco demanded, already dragging a fresh log into position. As the morning wore on, Marco's raw strength became impossible to ignore. He worked without rest, sawing through logs that would normally require 4 men to manage. The Amish men, no strangers to hard labor themselves, watched with growing respect as pile after pile of cut timber grew beside the barn. From the kitchen window of her family's home, Hulda watched the men work while helping her mother prepare the morning meal. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar motions of kneading bread, but her eyes kept straying to Marco's broad form. "He works hard," Hannah observed quietly, following her daughter's gaze. Hulda quickly looked down at her dough. "Yeah, he does. Strong enough for 3 men, that one." Hannah paused in her stirring. "But strength isn't everything, daughter. A gentle heart matters more." "I know, ma'am." Hulda pressed her fingers into the soft dough, considering. "But last night, when he agreed to follow our ways, there was something gentle in that, wasn't there?" Hannah smiled softly. "Perhaps the Lord is showing us there's more to him than we first thought." The day passed in a blur of activity. As dusk approached, Hulda's nervousness grew. Tonight would be their first proper courtship meeting, a hymn singing with the community. She chose her plainest dark dress with care, making sure every pin in her prayer covering was perfectly straight. By early evening, the Yoder's front room was filled with neighbors seated on borrowed benches. Lanterns cast a warm glow over the gathered faces, some curious, some still disapproving. Marco arrived last, having to duck his head to clear the doorframe. He looked uncomfortable in clean clothes, his dark hair still damp from washing. Samuel handed him a hymnal, showing him the page number. Marco held the book awkwardly, as if unsure how such a delicate thing should be handled by his large hands. The first hymn began, the familiar German words rising in well-practiced harmony. Marco's deep voice joined in and cracked spectacularly on the third note. Several young people giggled, quickly stifled by stern looks from their parents. Hulda, seated across the room, saw Marco's jaw clench. Without thinking, she raised her own voice slightly, letting the clear notes carry. After a moment, Marco's eyes found hers, and he tried again, following her lead. His voice was rough and untrained, but he managed to find the melody. As the evening progressed, Marco's singing improved marginally. He watched Hulda constantly, matching his voice to hers, struggling through the German words with determination, if not grace. When they reached Gott ist die Liebe, one of the simpler hymns, he even managed to stay on key for several measures. Finally, it was time for Marco to walk Hulda home, though they had never left her house. Still, tradition demanded they walk together, properly chaperoned, to maintain the forms of courtship. Hulda's younger sister, Ruth, volunteered to accompany them, carrying a lantern and walking several paces ahead. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered like diamond dust across the dark sky. Their boots squeaked on the packed snow as they walked the short distance around the house. Marco kept the proper distance between them, though Hulda could sense his discomfort with the formality. "Never learned much singing," he said gruffly, breaking the silence. "Just wolf howls and wind in the pines up in my mountains." "You did well for a first try," Hulda offered quietly. "The German words are difficult. Ain't used to gentle things," he glanced at her. "But I'm learning." They walked a few more steps in silence, then Marco asked, "What do you dream about? When you think on the future?" The question surprised her. Hulda considered carefully before answering. "I dream of having my own kitchen." Her voice grew softer. "A place where I can work without whispers or stares, where I can bake bread and put up preserves and know I'm doing it for my own family." She waited for him to laugh at such a simple dream. Instead, Marco stopped walking, turning to face her while maintaining their proper distance. "I'll build you a cabin," he said firmly. "Sturdy walls to keep out winter storms, big windows so you can see the mountains while you work, plenty of space for preserves and whatever else you need." His voice roughened. "No one will whisper there. No one will make you feel wrong for being exactly what you are." Hulda's heart beat faster at the conviction in his voice. "You would do that?" "Already started," he admitted. "Been working on it since first time I saw you at market 3 months ago. Got the walls up, roof's solid. Just needs the finishing inside." He paused. "Been waiting to know what kind of kitchen you'd want before I built that part." The simple honesty of his words brought unexpected tears to Hulda's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, conscious of Ruth watching from ahead. "Thank you," she whispered. They completed their circuit of the house in companionable silence. At the door, Samuel and Hannah waited. Samuel nodded approvingly at their proper separation, while Hannah's eyes were warm as she studied both their faces. "You're welcome to join us for supper tomorrow," Hannah offered. "We'll be having chicken and dumplings." "Much obliged," Marco replied, careful to direct his words to Samuel rather than Hulda, as was proper. As Marco's broad form disappeared into the darkness, Hulda heard the neighbors beginning to discuss the evening. Most spoke of Marco's awful singing, though some admitted his determination to learn was admirable. But a few voices carried darker undertones. "He's a brute," she heard Sarah Bontrager whisper to another woman. "Only after one thing, mark my words. No better than an animal, living wild in those mountains." "Poor Hulda," came the reply. Though perhaps she should be grateful, it's not as if she had other prospects. Hulda's cheeks burned, but before the shame could overwhelm her, she remembered Marco's words about her kitchen, about building a place where no one would whisper. She lifted her chin and walked inside, where her mother waited with understanding eyes. "He's trying, ain't he?" Hannah said softly, using the English word in private. "That means something." "Yeah," Hulda agreed, touching her prayer covering lightly. "He is." That night, as she prepared for bed, Hulda found herself humming one of the hymns from earlier. She could almost hear Marco's deep voice stumbling along, could picture his intense concentration as he tried to follow the unfamiliar words. A man that strong, that independent, willing to humble himself before the community. Perhaps there was indeed more to him than met the eye. The whispers about his brutish nature and base intentions still troubled her. But Hulda was beginning to sense something else beneath Marco's rough exterior, something that might, with God's grace, prove her neighbors wrong. The days following the hymn singing settled into a gentle rhythm. Morning frost painted the window panes with delicate patterns as Hulda woke each day to help her mother prepare breakfast. Through the kitchen window, she often glimpsed Marco's broad figure already at work in the pre-dawn light, splitting wood or helping neighbors with heavy tasks. On this particular morning, Marco had brought in 3 massive logs before the sun touched the horizon. The sharp crack of his axe echoed across the snow-covered yard as Hulda kneaded bread dough. She watched him work, noting how he paused to help young Matthew Miller stack smaller pieces for his mother's cookstove. "He's got away with the little ones," Hannah observed, stirring porridge at the hearth. "Did you see him teaching them to whittle yesterday?" Hulda nodded, remembering how Marco's huge hands had carefully guided small fingers in shaping wood. "He's gentler than people think." After breakfast, Marco appeared at the kitchen door, snow dusting his shoulders. "Thought you might like to learn something useful," he said, addressing Samuel rather than Hulda directly, as was proper. "Spotted some rabbit tracks near the woodlot." Samuel considered, then nodded. "Take your sister Ruth along," he told Hulda. The morning air bit sharp and clean as Hulda followed Marco's broad tracks through the snow, Ruth trailing behind them with bright eyes. Marco stopped at the edge of the woodlot, pointing to tiny impressions in the white powder. "See here." His voice was soft, different from his usual boom. "Rabbit came through before dawn. You can tell by how fresh the tracks are." Hulda leaned closer, fascinated by the delicate pattern. "They look like tiny hands." "That's right." Marco's approval warmed her more than it should. "Now watch how they move. Shows you where they're heading." He led them slowly through the trees, teaching them to read the story written in the snow. Hulda tried to step where he stepped, but her boots kept catching in the drifts. The third time she stumbled, Marco's hand twitched as if to catch her, but he kept the proper distance. "Maybe we should turn back," Ruth suggested, noting Hulda's reddened cheeks. "Just a bit further," Hulda said quickly. "I want to see where they lead." Marco's eyes crinkled at the corners, not quite a smile, but close. They followed the tracks to a hollow log, where fresh droppings showed the rabbit's morning feast of bark. That evening, as was becoming custom, Marco joined them by the fire after supper. Samuel read from scripture while Hannah mended, and Ruth dozed in the corner. When it was Hulda's turn to read, she chose Psalm 23, her voice steady, despite Marco's intense attention. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read, "I shall not want." "What does that mean?" Marco interrupted, then looked embarrassed at his breach of etiquette. "Begging pardon, just never understood that part." Samuel lowered his Bible, studying the younger man. "It means with God's guidance, we have everything we need. We don't want for more. Marco frowned thoughtfully. Even up in the mountains alone? Especially then, Hulda said softly. When we trust his path. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Hulda noticed Marco's hands, usually so restless, were still on his knees. His face held an expression she'd never seen before, like a man coming in from the cold. The peaceful moment shattered the next morning when Elder Matthias Stoltzfus arrived, his grave face suggesting serious business. Hulda listened from the kitchen as he spoke with her father in low tones. This Marco Kruger, the elder said, he has a reputation in the mining camps. Fighting, breaking bones. Is this the sort of man we want in our community? He's changing, Samuel replied. You've seen how he tries to follow our ways. A wolf may wear sheep's clothing, but its nature remains unchanged. Elder Matthias's voice hardened. I've heard things, Samuel. Dark things about his past. Think carefully before you give your daughter to such a man. Hulda's hands trembled as she shaped pretzels, trying not to listen but hearing every word. Before her father could respond, another visitor arrived, a well-dressed stranger in a bowler hat, carrying a leather portfolio. Mr. Samuel Yoder? The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. Samuel Pike, agent for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. Might I have a moment of your time? The news he brought sent ripples of fear through the community. The railroad's lease agreements, which had allowed the Amish families to farm this valley, were expiring in spring. Pike made it clear new terms would be less favorable, if they were offered at all. Progress requires sacrifice, Pike said smoothly, spreading papers across Samuel's table. The railroad's expansion cannot be impeded by traditional attachments to land. Hulda watched her father's face grow older as Pike spoke. Other families soon arrived, drawn by the news. The Millers, the Bontragers, all facing the same threat. Their voices filled the kitchen with worry. Where will we go? Sarah Bontrager wrung her hands. Our children were born here. The English courts won't help us, Jacob Miller said bitterly. They never do. Marco stood in the corner, silent but watchful. His presence seemed to grow as the others shrank in fear. When Pike rose to leave, Marco stepped forward, blocking his path. Might want to reconsider those terms, he said quietly. Pike's smile turned cold. Is that a threat, Mr. Kruger? I know your reputation. Violence won't serve here. This is a matter of law and progress. Progress, Marco spat the word. That what you call stealing homes? Marco. Hulda's soft voice cut through the tension. Please. He stepped aside, letting Pike pass, but his eyes never left the agent. After Pike left, the families huddled together, sharing fears and prayers. Hulda found herself watching Marco, seeing him with new eyes. He was the only one who hadn't shown fear, the only one who might have the strength to stand against the railroad's pressure. Later, as the winter sun set early behind the mountains, Marco walked with Hulda and Ruth in the snow-covered garden. Their boots crunched in the silence until Marco spoke. I meant what I said about building you a home, he said gruffly. Got my own land. Railroad can't touch it. High up, but good soil in the valley below. He paused. Could be room for others too, if needed. Hulda's heart jumped at what he was offering, not just a home for her, but sanctuary for her people. The elders don't trust you, she said quietly. Don't trust myself sometimes, his honesty surprised her. But I aim to prove myself before spring. To you. To them. He looked at her directly, his eyes intense. I know what it's like to lose everything. Won't let that happen to you or yours. Ruth cleared her throat pointedly, reminding them of her presence. They resumed walking, maintaining proper distance, but something had shifted between them. Hulda felt it in the winter air. Hope, mingled with fear and possibility. That night, after prayers, Hulda stood at her window watching snow fall in the moonlight. Below, she could see Marco's tracks from where he'd walked home, strong and sure in the gathering drifts. Like the rabbit trails he'd shown her, they told a story. One of a man trying to find his way from wilderness to warmth, from solitude to community. She touched the cold glass, thinking of Pike's threats and Marco's promise. Come spring, everything would change. The question was whether that change would bring destruction or deliverance. Hulda whispered a prayer into the darkness, asking for wisdom to know the difference. In her heart, she was beginning to understand why God might have brought this mountain of a man to their door, not just for her, but for all of them. The thought should have frightened her, but instead, it filled her with a strange calm. Like the psalm said, she would trust in the Lord's guidance, even when the path ahead seemed dark and uncertain. The January dawn painted the mountain snow in shades of rose and gold as Marco's axe bit into the first pine. The sharp crack echoed across the clearing, startling a pair of ravens into flight. He had chosen this spot carefully, sheltered from the worst winds, but with enough of a view that Hulda could see the valley spread below like a patchwork quilt of white fields and dark forests. Hulda sat on a fallen log nearby, wrapped in thick wool shawls, watching Marco work. Her breath clouded in the crisp air as she gathered small branches for kindling. Though the Ordnung usually forbade women from such manual labor, her father had agreed this was a special circumstance. After all, this would be her home. "The grain of this wood runs true," Marco called over his shoulder, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow despite the cold. "Good strong pines. They'll keep you warm come winter." Hulda ducked her head, pleased by the care in his voice. "And how long will it take to build?" "Depends on the weather." Marco squared up for another swing. "Need to fell at least 20 good trees. Then there's the hauling and squaring." The axe struck home with a satisfying thunk. "But I aim to have walls up before the spring thaw." Their horses stomped in the snow nearby, steam rising from their flanks. The trip from the settlement took nearly 3 hours each way, following a narrow track through the woods. They could only work for a few hours before heading back before sunset, as propriety demanded Hulda return home by dark. Day after day they made the journey. Sometimes Ruth came as chaperone, sometimes one of Hulda's younger brothers. They would help gather kindling while Marco worked, the steady rhythm of his axe marking time like a heartbeat in the winter silence. Hulda's hands, unused to such labor, soon developed blisters from splitting smaller logs for the fireplace. She didn't complain, though the rough work made her fingers ache. One afternoon, as she struggled with a particularly stubborn piece of wood, Marco paused in his work to watch her. "You've got grit," he said quietly. "Most folk wouldn't expect that looking at you." Hulda felt her cheeks warm, and not just from exertion. "I want to help," she said simply. "You do more than help." Marco's eyes held hers for a moment before returning to his work. "You give me purpose." The words stayed with her, warming her heart even as February storms forced them to suspend work for days at a time. When they could return, they found their clearing buried in fresh snow. Marco would spend hours just digging out their work site before he could continue felling trees. One particularly cold afternoon, Samuel Yoder rode out to inspect their progress. Hulda watched nervously as her father walked the perimeter of the half-built cabin, examining Marco's work with a critical eye. The foundation logs were solid, carefully notched and fitted. The beginnings of walls rose from the snow like the skeleton of a promise. "The joints are well cut," Samuel finally said, running his hand along a smoothly hewn beam. "You've done this before?" "Built my own place up higher," Marco replied, standing respectfully aside. "Learned by trial and error. This one will be better. Getting proper windows from town, once the walls are up." Samuel nodded slowly. "And the roof? Cedar shakes already started splitting them." Marco pointed to a neat stack of wooden shingles under a makeshift shelter. "Want it tight against the weather? For Hulda's sake." Something in Marco's tone made Samuel look at him sharply. After a long moment, he said, "You're serious about this?" "About her?" "More than I've ever been about anything, sir." That evening, Samuel invited Marco to stay for supper, a rare honor. As Hannah served her famous beef stew, Marco cleared his throat awkwardly. "Been meaning to ask," he said, glancing at Hulda. "About curtains. For the windows. What colors would you like?" The question was so unexpected, so domestic, that Hulda felt tears spring to her eyes. She tried to hide them by stirring her stew, but her voice wavered as she answered, "Maybe blue? Like cornflowers?" "Blue it is, then." Marco nodded decisively, as if memorizing an important fact. "Could put flower boxes under the windows, too, come summer, if you'd like that." Hulda had to excuse herself from the table, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of his planning. In the kitchen, She wiped her eyes with her apron, smiling through tears. He wasn't just building her a shelter. He was trying to create a real home, with curtains and flowers and all the small touches she'd dreamed of, but never dared hope for. But not everyone saw Marco's intentions as pure. Word of the cabin building spread through the community, carried by the same tongues that had always found reason to gossip about Hulda. She tried not to listen, but snippets reached her ears anyway. Of course he chose her. She overheard Jonas Miller tell his friends after Sunday service. Built like that, she'll give him those 5 sons quick enough. That's all he's after. Probably figures she'll be grateful for any husband, another added with a snicker. Even a wild man from the mountains. The word stung, reopening old wounds. That night, Hulda stood before her mirror, seeing herself through their eyes. Too large, too plain, desperate for marriage. But then she remembered Marco's face when he talked about curtains, the gentle way he praised her work, how he looked at her as if she were precious instead of pitiable. The next day, as they rode through fresh snow toward the clearing, Hulda sat straighter in her saddle. Let them talk. They didn't know Marco like she did, didn't see how he struggled to be gentle, how he worked until his hands bled, all to give her a future. You're quiet today, Marco observed as they reached the clearing. Just thinking, Hulda replied, dismounting carefully, about the home we're building. Marco paused in unloading his tools. Having second thoughts? No. Hulda met his eyes steadily. I'm grateful. Not because I think I don't deserve better, but because God sent me exactly what I needed. Someone who sees me truly. Marco's face softened in a way she'd never seen before. Without another word, he turned to his work, but his axe swung with renewed vigor, as if her faith in him lent strength to his arms. Ruth, who had accompanied them that day, watched this exchange with knowing eyes. Later, as they gathered kindling, she whispered to Hulda, I think the Lord knew what he was about, sending that mountain man to our barn raising? Hulda gathered another stick of kindling, remembering that first shocking moment when Marco had burst into their lives with his outrageous declaration. He's not what anyone expected, she admitted. No, Ruth agreed with a small smile. He's better, he's exactly what you need. The steady chunk of Marco's axe filled the winter air, each stroke bringing them closer to spring, closer to a future neither of them had dared imagine before that snowy night in the barn. Hulda bent to her own work, ignoring the blisters on her hands, steel entering her spine with every log she split. Let them whisper. She knew the truth. She was building something stronger than a cabin here. She was building a life. February brought the deepest snows anyone could remember. Drifts piled against the Yoder farmhouse windows, and the wind howled through the eaves like a hungry wolf. Travel between homesteads became treacherous, forcing families to stay close to their hearths. For Hulda, these housebound days brought an unexpected blessing. With work on the cabin halted by storms, Marco spent his evenings at her father's house instead. Following Amish custom, they sat on opposite sides of the great hearth, but the firelight drew them into a circle of warmth that seemed to shut out the rest of the world. One particularly bitter night, as Hannah mended by candlelight and Samuel dozed in his chair, Marco's deep voice broke the comfortable silence. Never had evenings like this growing up, he said, staring into the flames. Just me and my pa in a one-room cabin. He'd drink himself to sleep most nights. Hulda's hand stilled on her quilting. Marco rarely spoke of his past. She waited, hardly daring to breathe as he continued. Learned to hunt young, had to. Pa would disappear for weeks tracking elk or trading furs. His shoulders hunched slightly. Remember watching other families in town, all sitting down together for supper. Never knew what that was like. Hannah looked up from her mending, her eyes soft with motherly concern. And your mother? Died when I was born. Pa never forgave me for that. Marco's voice grew distant. Used to beat me something fierce when he'd been drinking. Day I turned 14, I ran. Been alone in the mountains ever since. The quiet that followed felt heavy with shared pain. Hulda's heart ached for the lonely boy he'd been. Without thinking, she rose and crossed to the shelf where her mother kept the family Bible. We say grace before every meal, she said gently, returning to her seat. Would you like to learn? Marco's eyes widened slightly as if surprised by the offer. Reckon I'd just mess it up. The Lord doesn't mind simple words, Hannah said, smiling. He hears the heart behind them. So began a new routine. Each evening, Huldah would teach Marco a different prayer. Grace before meals, evening benedictions, morning thanksgivings. His huge hands would fumble with the small prayer book, but his voice grew steadier with practice. One night, after several false starts, he managed to recite grace perfectly before supper. The pride in his eyes when Samuel nodded approval made him look almost boyish. You're a good teacher, he told Huldah later as they sat by the fire. Patient-like. You're a willing student, she replied softly. That makes it easy. The next hymn singing came on a clear, cold Sunday evening. The moon hung like a silver lamp over the snow as families gathered in the miller's barn. Huldah's heart quickened when Marco entered, ducking his head under the door frame. He'd trimmed his beard and worn his cleanest shirt, though it still strained across his massive shoulders. When the singing began, Huldah held her breath, remembering his first awkward attempts. But Marco's voice rose, clear and strong, joining the familiar German words with newfound confidence. She caught him watching her across the room, his eyes steady and warm in the lamplight. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. The voices rose together, and Huldah felt tears prick her eyes at the beauty of it, Marco's deep bass weaving through the melody, belonging there as if it had always been part of the song. But the peace of the evening shattered during the social hour afterward. As women laid out refreshments, Huldah overheard angry whispers from a group of young men near the door. Look at him, pretending to be civilized, Jonas Miller's voice carried clearly. We all know what he really wants, a strong back and wide hips to bear his brats. Ain't that the truth? Another added with a cruel laugh. Good thing Huldah's got plenty of both. Probably figures she should be grateful anyone would have her at all. The words struck like physical blows. Huldah's hands trembled as she set down her plate of cookies. She looked up to see several women watching her with pitying eyes, and something inside her crumbled. Without a word, she fled through the barn doors into the bitter night. Snow crunched under her boots as she ran blindly, not caring where she went. The moon cast blue shadows across the unmarked drifts, and her tears froze on her cheeks. She didn't hear the heavy footsteps behind her until a voice called out, "Huldah, wait!" But she couldn't face Marco now, not with those cruel words still ringing in her ears. She plunged deeper into the shadows between the trees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. A branch caught her skirt, sending her stumbling to her knees in the snow. The cold bit through her dress, but she couldn't find the strength to rise. Hot tears spilled down her face as all the old hurts welled up. Years of sidelong glances, whispered jokes, the pain of being different. Heavy boots crunched in the snow beside her. Then Marco's huge form knelt down, blocking the wind. "You'll freeze out here," he said gruffly. She heard him shrug out of his bearskin coat. A moment later, its warm weight settled around her shoulders. Huldah clutched the fur closer, still unable to look at him. "You heard what they said?" "Heard enough." His voice was tight with anger. "Want me to go back and teach them some manners?" Despite everything, a watery laugh escaped her. "That wouldn't help." "No." He sighed heavily. "Reckon not." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind in the pines. Then Marco spoke again, his voice unusually hesitant. "They don't understand," he said. "How could they? They've never been truly alone." Huldah looked up at last. Marco's face was half in shadow, but his eyes gleamed in the moonlight. "All these years in the mountains," he continued slowly, as if each word cost him effort. "Never needed nobody. Told myself I was better off that way. But then I saw you in that barn, carrying them pies, looking so." He gestured helplessly. "So kind, so real. And something in me just knew." He fell silent, struggling for words. Huldah barely breathed, waiting. "You're the only one," he finally said, "who ever made me feel less alone." The simple truth in his voice brought fresh tears to Huldah's eyes, but these were different, warm instead of bitter. She saw then what no one else had seen, the lonely boy still living in the mountain man's heart, reaching out for connection at last. "I feel less alone too," she whispered. Marco's hand moved as if to touch her face, then dropped back to his side, remembering the courtship rules. But his eyes held hers with a tenderness that needed no touch to convey. "We should head back," he said eventually. "Your folks will worry." Hulda nodded, letting him help her to her feet. As they walked through the moonlit snow, his coat still wrapped around her shoulders, she felt something shift inside her, as if her heart had grown larger, making room for this new understanding between them. Let them whisper, she thought. They don't know Marco's heart, they don't see how he's changing, softening like winter ground preparing for spring. They don't understand that true strength isn't in the body at all. It's in having the courage to let someone see your loneliness and reach out to meet it with their own. The March wind whistled through the valley, carrying the promise of spring even as patches of snow still dotted the ground. Inside Marco's nearly finished cabin, Hulda knelt on the rough-hewn floorboards, her arms aching as she scrubbed them with lye soap and a stiff brush. The wood was beginning to gleam under her determined strokes. Through the empty window frame, she watched Marco wrestling with the door he'd carved himself. His massive shoulders bunched as he fitted the iron hinges, muttering under his breath when they didn't align perfectly. The door was simple but solid, made from thick pine planks bound with metal straps. A home needs a proper door, he'd told her yesterday, something strong enough to keep the wild things out. Now, as the hinges finally caught with a satisfying click, a rare smile crossed his weathered face. He stepped back, testing the swing with careful pride. "Well done," came a quiet voice from behind them. Hulda turned to see her father, Samuel Yoder, standing in the doorway. He'd ridden up to check their progress, as he did every few days. His eyes moved slowly around the cabin, taking in the sturdy walls, the stone fireplace, the small window frames waiting for glass. "You've kept your word thus far," Samuel continued, nodding at Marco. "The work is good." Marco straightened, clearly pleased by the praise, though he tried not to show it. "Still needs the roof finished, and glass for the windows, but it'll be ready before—" The thunder of hoofbeats cut him off. 3 riders approached at a gallop, kicking up mud from the thawing ground. Hulda recognized the lead rider's bowler hat and neat coat. Samuel Pike, the railroad agent who had been nosing around the valley. Behind him rode Deputy Wade Harlan and another man she didn't know. Marco's face darkened as they dismounted. He moved to stand between them and the cabin door, his stance protective. Pike removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Good day to you all. I see you're still improving the property." "My property," Marco growled. "That's actually why we're here." Pike pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I have orders from the railroad company. This entire valley has been designated for the new rail line. All current residents must vacate by summer's end." Samuel Yoder stepped forward, his normally calm voice tight with concern. "We have deeds to this land. Our community has farmed here for 10 years. "Leased land," Pike corrected smoothly. "Those leases expire in August, and they will not be renewed." "You can't do this," Hulda burst out, surprising herself. "These are our homes." Deputy Harlan sneered. "Better start packing, fat girl, because come summer, anything still standing gets burned." Marco moved so fast Hulda barely saw it. One moment he was by the door, the next he had Harlan by the throat, lifting him clear off his feet. "Say that again," Marco snarled, his face inches from the deputy's purpling features. "Marco, no," Hulda cried, "please." Pike's hand moved to his gun. "Release him, Kruger, or this gets ugly." For a terrible moment, Hulda thought Marco would crush the deputy's windpipe, but then Samuel Yoder's quiet voice cut through the tension. "Violence brings only more violence, Marco. Let him go." Slowly, deliberately, Marco lowered Harlan back to his feet. The deputy stumbled away, gasping and rubbing his throat. "You're finished here, mountain man," he wheezed. "You and your fat bride both?" "Get off my land," Marco said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now." Pike replaced his hat with careful precision. "We'll be back, with more men, and proper authority." He turned to Samuel Yoder. "Tell your people to start making arrangements. This valley will be cleared, one way or another." They mounted up and rode away, Harlan still coughing. Marco stood rigid until they disappeared from view, his fists clenched at his sides. Samuel Yoder sighed heavily. "I should return to the settlement. The elders must hear of this." He touched Hulda's shoulder gently. "Come, daughter. It's getting late." But Hulda looked at Marco's face, still dark with rage, and made a decision. "I'll stay a while longer, Papa. The floors need finishing." Her father studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Don't stay past sunset." He mounted his horse and rode down the trail, leaving them alone with the cooling afternoon. Marco paced to the cabin like a caged bear, his boots leaving muddy prints on Hulda's clean floors. She said nothing, just retrieved her brush and soap and resumed scrubbing. The rhythmic sound seemed to calm him somewhat. Finally, he stopped pacing. "You should eat something, been working all day." From her basket, Hulda pulled out fresh bread and cheese she'd brought from home. Marco sat beside her on a rough bench, their shoulders nearly touching. They shared the simple meal in silence, watching shadows lengthen across the valley below. "It's peaceful here," Hulda said softly. "The view reminds me of that psalm about lifting eyes unto the hills." Marco grunted. "Won't be peaceful when they come back. If those deputies try to burn one Amish home, I'll put them in the ground." His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "Won't let them hurt you or yours." Hulda's heart clenched at his words. "Violence isn't our way, Marco. We trust in God's protection. God helps those who help themselves. He helps those who help others," she corrected gently. "Through love, not force." Marco was quiet for a long moment. "Never had much use for love before," he finally said. "Learned early that fists speak clearer than words." Hulda gathered her courage and placed her hand near his on the bench, not touching, but close enough to feel his warmth. "You're learning new words now. I see it every day." He looked down at their almost touching hands. "At this cabin, it's the first thing I ever built for someone else. Always just survived before. Took what I needed." His voice roughened. "But watching you here, planning curtains and such, makes me want different things." "What things?" Hulda whispered. A real home, not just shelter." He gestured at the newly hung door. "Something worth protecting. Right way, not just with fists." Hulda blinked back tears, touched by the simple honesty in his voice. For the first time, she truly let herself imagine living here as his wife, cooking at that fireplace, hanging herbs to dry from the rafters, sharing quiet evenings like this one. Not a burden to be borne, but a partner in building something new. "We'll find a way," she said firmly, "one that keeps faith with both strength and peace." Marco nodded slowly, though she could see the anger still simmering beneath his surface. She prayed it would be enough, his growing gentleness, her quiet faith, their shared determination to build something lasting. The sun was setting now, painting the unfinished cabin in shades of gold. "Time to head back," Marco said, rising reluctantly. "Your pa will worry." As they walked down the trail, Hulda looked back at the cabin one last time. The new door stood strong and straight, a promise of home in a world of uncertainty. She offered up a silent prayer, not just for protection but for wisdom to guide Marco's fierce heart toward peace. The evening light caught his profile as he helped her mount her horse, and she saw again that mix of strength and tenderness that had first drawn her to him. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The mountain man learning grace, and the Amish girl finding her own kind of courage. The late winter sun streamed through windows of the Yoder home, where a dozen Amish women gathered with needles and thread. Their nimble fingers worked steadily, turning plain black fabric into a proper suit for Marco. Hulda sat among them, her own needle moving carefully through the hem of what would be her wedding dress. Sarah Bontrager, the community's most skilled seamstress, held up the half-finished suit jacket with a critical eye. "He'll need broader shoulders than any man I've ever fitted," she mused, "like sewing for a bear." The women chuckled softly, but Hulda noticed their glances, some kind, others wary. She focused on her stitching, trying to ignore the whispers that had followed her since Marco's proposal. The door creaked open and Marco himself ducked through, having to bend his tall frame to enter. The chattering women fell silent. He stood awkwardly, his massive shoulders seeming to fill the small room. "Time for your fitting," Sarah announced briskly, holding out the partially completed jacket. "Arms up." Marco complied with surprising gentleness, though his face reddened as Sarah pulled the fabric across his chest. Hulda watched him submit to the measuring and pinning, touched by his willingness to endure such fussing for her sake. Too tight here, Sarah muttered, marking a spot with chalk, and the sleeves need lengthening. Through the open window, male voices drifted in from the barn. Mountain man in plain clothes, like putting a wolf in sheep's wool. Laughter followed. Marco's jaw tightened, but he remained still under Sarah's hands. Hulda's needle slipped, pricking her finger. A drop of blood welled up, staining the white fabric. "Never mind," Rebecca Miller said kindly, helping her dab it away. "A bride's blood in her wedding dress brings blessing." She smiled at Hulda. "My mother always said so." The fitting continued as afternoon light slanted across the floorboards. Finally, Sarah stepped back, satisfied. "It will do, though you'll need to mind those shoulders, or you'll split the seams." Marco nodded stiffly. Much obliged, he turned to leave, then paused. "Hulda, might I have a word?" She followed him onto the porch, conscious of the women watching through the windows. Marco reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. "Made this," he said gruffly, pressing it into her hands. "Ain't much, but—" Hulda unwrapped the bundle to find a wooden spoon. It was roughly carved, the handle slightly crooked but smooth to her touch. She ran her fingers over the careful details. Little leaves etched along the handle, her initials carved at the base. "Oh," she breathed. "It's beautiful." "Took 3 tries," Marco admitted. "Never carved nothing so small before. Usually just stakes for traps or—" She touched his arm, stopping his words. "Thank you, I'll treasure it always." His eyes softened, and for a moment Hulda glimpsed the tender heart beneath his gruff exterior. Then Sarah called from inside. "Hulda, we need you for the bodice fitting." That evening, as shadows lengthened across the valley, both families gathered for supper at the Yoder home. The table groaned under dishes brought by Hulda's mother: roasted chicken, fresh bread, pickled vegetables from last summer's garden. Marco sat somewhat stiffly in his borrowed plain clothes, but he'd learned to wait for grace to be said before eating. Samuel Yoder cleared his throat as the meal drew to a close. "I've given this much prayer," he began slowly, "and while some question this match—" He paused, looking at Marco. "I've watched you these past weeks, seen you submit to our ways, though they're strange to you. Seen you work honest labor, building a home with your hands." Hulda held her breath, hope rising in her chest. "You have my blessing," her father said finally. "But hear me well. Our people follow the path of peace. There must be no violence in the home you build with my daughter." Marco met the older man's gaze steadily. "I mean to give her a proper home, safe and peaceful-like." "Then let us thank God for his guidance, Indy." Samuel bowed his head, and all followed suit as he prayed in German. Afterward, Hulda's mother brought out an apple pie still warm from the oven. The rich scent filled the room as she cut generous slices. Talk turned to wedding preparations. Which hymns would be sung? How many benches needed for guests? Hulda watched Marco take his first bite of pie, saw his eyes widen at the sweetness. He caught her looking, and the corner of his mouth lifted in a small smile. Her heart warmed at this simple sharing of pleasure. Laughter rose softly around the table. Her mother telling stories of her own wedding day, Marco's awkward attempts at Pennsylvania Dutch phrases. For a precious moment, it felt like any other family gathering, full of hope and simple joy. But through the window, Hulda glimpsed the orange glow of campfires in the distance, where railroad men had set up their temporary camp. The sight sent a chill through her contentment. She saw Marco notice them too, his shoulders tensing slightly. Her fingers found the wooden spoon in her pocket, touching its smooth surface like a talisman. Whatever came, they would face it together. The mountain man learning gentleness, the plain girl finding strength. She offered up a silent prayer of gratitude for this moment of peace, even as she prayed for wisdom to meet the storms ahead. "More pie?" her mother offered, and the warmth of family drew Hulda back to the present. Around her, voices mingled in easy conversation as evening settled over the valley. Marco's deep laugh joined her father's, and Hulda let herself simply be grateful for this gift of belonging. Sarah Bontrager began discussing final details for the wedding clothes, while Hulda's mother planned the feast. The gentle rhythm of their words wove around her like a familiar hymn, grounding her in the preciousness of candlelight, cooling pie, and the promise of home. The night air held the crisp promise of spring as lantern lights spilled from the barn windows, warming the gathering darkness. Inside, 36 Amish families filled the benches, their voices raised in harmonious German hymns that echoed against the freshly raised beams. The scent of roasted chicken, warm bread, and apple pies mingled with the sweet perfume of hay and fresh wood. Marco sat stiffly on the front bench, his massive frame seeming out of place in his new plain clothes. Yet his deep voice had grown steadier over the weeks of practice, no longer cracking on the high notes. His eyes remained fixed on Hulda, who sat across the center aisle with the women, wearing a simple blue dress that brought out the warmth in her cheeks. "Blessed be the tie that binds," the congregation sang, their voices swelling in the familiar melody. Hulda's clear soprano lifted above the others, and Marco's bass followed, finding its place in the harmony. Her father, Samuel Yoder, nodded approval at their blended voices. Between hymns, Elder Matthias Stoltzfus rose to address the gathering. "Tomorrow," he intoned solemnly, "we witness the joining of two souls before God. Let us pray that His wisdom guides their path." Though his words were proper, his eyes settled with lingering doubt on Marco. The singing gave way to the wedding feast spread across trestle tables that groaned under the weight of dozens of dishes. Women bustled about, arranging platters of fried chicken, bowls of tender noodles, and golden loaves of fresh bread. Hulda moved among them with quiet grace, helping to serve despite protests that a bride-to-be should sit and rest. "You look well, child," Rebecca Miller whispered, squeezing Hulda's hand. "There's joy in your eyes tonight." Hulda blushed, sneaking another glance at Marco. He sat awkwardly among the men, his plate piled high with food, trying to remember to eat slowly as was proper. When their eyes met across the room, his expression softened in a way that made her heart flutter. The peaceful evening air suddenly shattered with the thunder of approaching hooves. Shouts and crude laughter carried through the open barn doors, followed by the sharp crack of a pistol fired into the air. Children screamed and several women clutched their prayer caps in fear. 6 railroad deputies rode into the lantern light, their horses' hooves churning up the dirt. Deputy Wade Harlan led them, swaying drunkenly in his saddle, a bottle of whiskey clutched in one hand. "Well, ain't this a pretty little party?" Harlan slurred, dismounting unsteadily. "Celebrating while you squat on railroad land?" Marco rose slowly to his full height, his hands clenching into fists. Elder Stoltzfus stepped forward, palms raised. "Friend, we mean no trouble. This is a wedding feast." "Wedding?" Harlan spat in the dirt. "Heard about that, the mountain savage and his fat bride." He laughed cruelly, and his fellow deputies joined in. Hulda felt the familiar shame burn her cheeks, but she lifted her chin, refusing to cower. She saw Marco's shoulders tense, noticed the dangerous stillness coming over him like a storm about to break. "Leave," Samuel Yoder commanded firmly. "You have no right to disturb peaceful folk at worship." "No right?" Another deputy swung down from his horse, stumbling toward the feast tables. "We got every right. Come summer, this'll all be railroad property." He seized a pie and hurled it into the dirt, then kicked over a pot of coffee. Children began to cry as the deputies grew bolder, shoving tables and scattering food across the ground. One of them produced a torch, touching it to a nearby wagon. Flames leaped up, casting wild shadows across the scene. "Stop this," Hulda cried out, her voice stronger than she knew it could be. "Please." Harlan turned toward her, sneering. "Shut your mouth, girl, unless you want to see your precious barn burn too." It happened in an instant. Marco moved with terrible speed for such a large man, crossing the space between them in 2 strides. His hand closed around Harlan's throat, lifting the deputy clear off his feet. The whiskey bottle shattered on the ground as Harlan clawed helplessly at Marco's iron grip. "Marco, no!" Hulda screamed, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. Marco's face was transformed with rage, all trace of gentleness gone. He slammed Harlan against a support beam, the deputy's head cracking against the wood. His massive hands began to squeeze. "You die tonight," Marco growled, his voice barely human. Harlan's face turned purple, his eyes bulging. His fellow deputies drew their pistols, but feared to fire with their leader in Marco's grasp. "Marco!" Hulda ran forward, her skirts flying. "In God's name, stop. This is not his way." For one terrible moment, she thought he wouldn't hear her. Then Elder Stoltzfus and 3 other men grabbed Marco's arms, straining to pull him back. "Release him, brother," the elder commanded. "Do not stain this holy night with blood." Slowly, like a man waking from a trance, Marco's fingers loosened. Harlan collapsed, gasping and retching in the dirt. 2 deputies rushed to help him up, while the others kept their guns trained on Marco. "Attempted murder," Harlan wheezed, rubbing his throat. "Assault on a lawman. You're finished, mountain man." He spat blood, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "Clap him in irons, boys. He'll cool his temper in the town jail." "No," Hulda whispered, but she knew it was too late. The piece they'd built so carefully lay shattered like the whiskey bottle in the dirt. The deputies produced heavy chains, approaching Marco cautiously. He stood unresisting now, his rage spent, as they shackled his wrists. Hulda saw the shame creep into his eyes as he realized what he'd done. "Hulda," he said hoarsely, but she turned away, unable to bear the sight of him in chains. They led him away into the darkness, the clink of his shackles a bitter counterpoint to the hymns that had filled the air moments before. The burning wagon cast orange light across the ruined feast, across faces stunned with grief and fear. Dawn came cold and gray, finding Hulda kneeling in prayer in her small bedroom. Her wedding dress hung like a ghost by the window, a reminder of dreams now broken. From somewhere in the house, she heard her mother weeping softly. Word spread quickly through the community. Marco sat in the town jail, facing serious charges. The wedding was canceled. Already, cruel whispers began. Poor Hulda Yoder couldn't even keep her man till the vows were spoken. She touched the wooden spoon Marco had carved for her, still tucked in her apron pocket. Such tender care in its making, such hope. Now all lay in ruins, like the scattered feast in the barnyard. "The Lord gives and takes away," Elder Stoltzfus had said gravely, when he came to speak with her father. Perhaps this is his mercy, showing the true nature of that man before it was too late. But Hulda's heart knew different. She had seen Marco's gentleness, watched him learn to sing hymns and bow his head in prayer. Yet she had also seen the darkness in him, the violence that could explode like summer lightning. Now she understood the true weight of her father's warning about bringing violence into their peaceful home. In the early morning quiet, she heard the neighbors beginning to arrive, come to help clean away the destruction from the night before. Soon she would have to face them, endure their pitying looks and whispered comments. She would have to be strong, as her mother had taught her. But for now, she let her tears fall silently, mourning the death of simple dreams, a cabin filled with love, children's laughter, hymns sung in harmony beside a warm hearth. Outside her window, the sun rose fully over the Colorado highlands, painting the snow-touched peaks in rose and gold. Another day begun, though nothing would ever be the same. Hulda squared her shoulders and rose from her knees. There was work to be done, and she would face it with the quiet dignity her people had always shown in times of trial. But deep in her heart, a small voice whispered that this story was not yet finished, that somewhere between violence and peace, between mountain justice and God's law, a path forward waited to be found. The church benches creaked under shifting weight as the congregation settled for Sunday service. Hulda sat beside her parents, her black dress buttoned tight against the morning chill. The familiar scent of wood smoke and beeswax candles filled the air, but today brought no comfort. Whispers rustled like dry leaves behind her. Such violence in a man. Never should have trusted him. Poor Hulda. Better off alone than with a brute. She kept her head bowed, fingers tracing the worn pages of her Bible. The leather binding was soft from the years of daily reading. Its verses had always given her strength. Now she needed that strength more than ever. Elder Stoltzfus stood to lead the opening hymn. Hulda's throat tightened as the first notes rose. It was the same hymn Marco had finally learned to sing properly just last week. His deep voice had filled their kitchen, rough but earnest. The memory brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Let us pray for those who walk in darkness," Elder Stoltzfus intoned, "that they might find the path of peace." Hulda knew the words were meant for Marco. Her cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin slightly. They didn't understand him like she did. They hadn't seen his gentle hands carving that wooden spoon, hadn't witnessed his patients learning their ways. After service, Sister Rebecca touched Hulda's arm. "Perhaps it's for the best, dear. A man with such anger." She shook her head. "We'll help you find someone more suitable." "Marco is my choice," Hulda said quietly but firmly. "I won't renounce him." Rebecca's eyes widened and she hurried away to whisper with other women. Hulda's mother squeezed her hand in silent support. That afternoon, Hulda hitched their old mare to the buggy. Her father tried to discourage her from going to town, but she remained resolute. "I must see him," she insisted. "The Lord teaches us not to abandon those in need." The journey took nearly 2 hours. Hulda used the time to pray, watching the late winter landscape roll past. Patches of snow still clung to the shadowed hollows, though spring's first green touched the southern slopes. The jail squatted at the edge of town, a squat building of gray stone. Sheriff Miller looked up from his desk as Hulda entered, her boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. "Come to see the mountain man?" he asked, not unkindly. "He's been quiet since they brought him in. No trouble, just sits there like a bear in a trap." Hulda followed him down a short hallway. The smell of old sweat and tobacco smoke made her nose wrinkle. Marco sat on a narrow cot in the last cell, his massive frame making the space seem even smaller. He looked up as they approached, his eyes lighting with recognition. 10 minutes, the sheriff said, unlocking the cell door. "I'll be at my desk if you need anything." Hulda stepped inside, her skirts brushing against the iron bars. For a long moment, neither spoke. Marco's wrists bore red marks from the chains, and his beard had grown wilder. Yet his eyes held shame beneath their defiance. "You shouldn't have come," he said roughly. "Not proper for a woman of faith to visit jail." "I came because I choose to," Hulda replied, "as I chose you." Marco stood suddenly, pacing the small cell like a caged animal. "I only wanted to protect you. That deputy, the way he spoke to you." His hands clenched. "No man speaks to my woman that way. And now you sit in jail while the railroad men still threaten our land." Hulda's voice remained gentle but firm. "True strength isn't in violence, Marco. It's in restraint." He stopped pacing, struck by her words. "What would you have had me do, stand there while they insulted you? Burned our wagon?" "I would have you remember the promises you made, to follow our ways, to build a peaceful home." Hulda stepped closer, though bars separated them. "Violence only breeds more violence. You know this in your heart." Marco slumped onto the cot, his great shoulders bowing. "I've shamed you," he whispered. "Ruined everything we built." "No." Hulda's voice grew stronger. "Only if we let this defeat us. Only if you choose rage over love." He fell silent, staring at his calloused hands. Hands that had nearly killed a man, yet had also carved her a spoon with such care. Hulda saw the struggle in his face, the battle between the lonely mountain man who knew only force and the gentle soul learning to trust in grace. The sheriff's boots echoed down the hallway. "Time's up, Miss Yoder." "I'll return tomorrow," Hulda promised. "We'll find a way through this together." Marco looked up, his eyes wet. "Why do you still believe in me?" "Because God believes in second chances," she said simply. "And so do I." The ride home seemed longer, darkness gathering early in the winter sky. When Hulda arrived, she found her father in serious discussion with several elders. Papers lay scattered across their kitchen table. "Eviction notices from the railroad company." "They're offering to buy us out," her father said wearily. "Maybe we should accept. Find new land elsewhere." "No." Hulda removed her bonnet, speaking with quiet conviction. "This is our home. Our community. We must fight this." "Fight?" Elder Stoltzfus raised his eyebrows. "We are a peaceful people, child." "There are ways to fight without violence," and Hulda insisted. "Through the courts, through unity. Marco taught me that sometimes we must stand firm." "Marco," someone scoffed, "the man who nearly killed a deputy?" "A man who is learning," Hulda corrected, "as we all must learn to face these changing times without losing our faith." The men exchanged glances, but Hulda saw uncertainty replace dismissal in some faces. Her father studied her with new eyes, as if seeing not his unmarriageable daughter, but a woman of strength. That night, alone in her small bedroom, Hulda knelt beside her bed. The familiar quilt, sewn by her mother's hands, muffled her tears as she prayed. The moonlight fell across her floor in silver bars, like the jail cell where Marco sat alone. "Lord," she whispered, "give me wisdom to guide him. Give me strength to stand firm. Show us both the path through this valley of shadows." Her fingers found the wooden spoon in her apron pocket. Such a simple thing, roughly made but filled with love. Like Marco himself, unfinished, imperfect, yet capable of beauty when shaped by patient hands. Hulda dried her tears and rose from her knees. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more whispers to endure, more battles to fight. But tonight, she had found her answer. She would not abandon Marco to his darkness. Together, they would find a way to blend his strength with her faith, to build something stronger than either of them alone. Outside her window, a whippoorwill called into the night. The sound reminded her of hymns sung in harmony, of quiet evenings by the fire, of a future still waiting to be born. Hulda tucked the spoon beneath her pillow and lay down to sleep, her heart at peace with her choice. Her last thought before drifting off was a prayer of thanks, not for an easy path, but for the courage to walk a difficult one with faith as her guide. The early spring sun cast long shadows across the dirt road as Hulda's buggy rattled toward town. Each morning for the past 3 days, she had made this journey, her basket filled with fresh bread and her mother's Bible tucked safely beside her. The old mare knew the path now, plodding steadily through patches of melting snow. Sheriff Miller nodded as she entered the jail, no longer surprised by her daily visits. "He's been reading that Bible you left," he mentioned, unlocking the cell door. "Never seen a man his size handle pages so careful-like." Marco sat cross-legged on his cot, the small Bible dwarfed in his weathered hands. He looked up as Hulda approached, his eyes softer than they had been that first night. "Brought you fresh bread," Hulda said, settling onto the wooden stool outside his cell, "and some of Mother's raspberry preserves." Marco accepted the food through the bars, his movements measured now, controlled. "Much obliged," he murmured. "Been thinking on that passage you showed me yesterday, about turning the other cheek." Hulda unwrapped her own piece of bread, sharing the meal as best they could through iron bars. "And what do you make of it? Reckon it's harder than facing down a grizzly?" Marco's voice grew rough. "All my life I only knew one way, fight or die, like my father before me." His hands trembled slightly as he set down the bread. "That's what fears me most, Hulda, becoming him. Man was nothing but rage and whiskey, beating on anything that moved slow enough to hit." Hulda reached through the bars, her fingers brushing his arm. "But you're not him, Marco. You're choosing a different path right here, right now." "Am I?" His laugh held no humor. "Sitting in jail for nearly killing a man? Seems I'm walking his exact footsteps." "No." Hulda's voice grew firm. "Your father never would have submitted to arrest, never would have listened to scripture or tried to understand our ways. You're different because you're willing to change." Marco fell silent, considering her words. Outside, a spring rain began to patter against the jail's small window. The sound reminded Hulda of quiet evenings in the cabin Marco had built before everything went wrong. "Tell me about your father," she said softly. "Help me understand." Marco's shoulders tensed, but he spoke slowly, measuring each word. "He was a trapper like me. Came west with nothing but a rifle and mean dreams. Beat my mother till she died of it. I was 12 when I ran into the mountains. Learned to survive alone rather than face his fists." Hulda's heart ached at the pain in his voice. "And now you fear that anger lives in you?" "It does live in me." Marco's hands clenched. "I feel it burning, same as his. That night at the feast, when those deputies came." He shook his head. "It was like his ghost took hold of me." "But you stopped," Hulda reminded him. "When I called out, you stopped. Your father never would have done that." The rain fell harder now, drumming against the roof. Marco lifted his eyes to meet hers. "How can you still have faith in me?" "Because I see your heart," Hulda said simply. "I see how gentle you are with frightened horses, how careful your hands were building our cabin. That's the true Marco, not your father's ghost." A tear rolled into Marco's beard, though he tried to hide it. "You make me want to be better," he whispered, "to be worthy of such faith." They sat in comfortable silence, sharing the rest of the bread. Hulda opened her mother's Bible, reading passages about mercy and redemption. Marco listened intently, sometimes asking questions that showed a deeper understanding than many gave him credit for. As evening approached, Hulda reluctantly prepared to leave. The ride home would be wet and cold, but her heart felt warmer than it had in days. Marco's transformation, though slow, gave her hope. Back home, the house was quiet. Her father had gone to help a neighbor repair storm damage, leaving Hulda alone with her thoughts. She lit a lamp and settled at the kitchen table, drawing out her mother's Bible again. The familiar leather binding, worn smooth by years of faithful hands, brought memories of her mother's voice reading scripture on winter evenings. Hulda traced the cover gently, remembering how her mother had taught her to find strength in faith, not fear in difference. As she opened the Bible, a folded paper slipped from between its pages. Curious, Hulda smoothed it open, her eyes widening as she read. It was a land lease, dated 15 years ago, signed in her mother's neat hand. The document granted their family legal claim to 160 acres, their entire homestead. Hulda's hands trembled as she read further. The lease had been properly filed with the Territorial Land Office, witnessed, and sealed. According to these papers, the railroad had no right to evict them. Their land was legally protected. She sat back, stunned by the discovery. Her mother, always quiet but wise, had secured their future before her death. The railroad's threats were empty. They had no authority to seize properly leased land. But wisdom stayed Hulda's hand from immediately revealing the document. The railroad agent, Samuel Pike, was a dangerous man who had already shown he would use violence to achieve his ends. She needed to be careful, to choose the right moment. Hulda folded the lease carefully and slipped it into her sewing basket, beneath layers of fabric. Tonight, she would pray for guidance on when to use this precious gift from her mother. For now, it was enough to know that hope existed. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Hulda packed her basket with fresh bread and early spring vegetables from the root cellar. As she hitched the mare to her buggy, she noticed more railroad men making camp at the edge of their land. Their presence felt less threatening now, knowing she held the key to their salvation in her sewing basket. At the jail, Marco seemed calmer than ever before. He sat with the Bible open on his knee, marking passages with a blade of grass. "Been thinking more about that prodigal son story," he said as Hulda settled onto her stool. "About how the father welcomed him home, no matter what he'd done." "God's mercy is like that," Hulda agreed, "available to all who truly seek it." Marco's eyes grew distant. "My father never sought mercy, never admitted he needed it. That's the difference, ain't it? Being willing to change." "Yes." Hulda smiled softly. "That's exactly it." They shared their simple meal, talking quietly about scripture and redemption. Marco spoke more of his past, of lonely years in the mountains, of learning to trust only his own strength. But now his words held reflection rather than pride. "I was wrong," he admitted, "thinking I could live without people, without God, thinking strength meant never bending." "The strongest trees bend in the wind," Hulda reminded him. "It's the brittle ones that break." Marco nodded slowly. "Reckon I'm learning to bend then, thanks to you." As Hulda prepared to leave that evening, she paused at the cell door. "Keep faith," she whispered. "God hasn't forgotten us." The knowledge of her mother's lease burned in her heart, but she held her tongue. The time wasn't right yet. First, Marco needed to complete his transformation from mountain man to man of faith. Their community needed to see his change was genuine. Riding home through the gathering dusk, Hulda heard coyotes calling in the distance. Their wild songs reminded her of Marco, untamed yet capable of harmony when given the chance. She touched her sewing basket, feeling the precious document hidden within. "Thank you, Mother," she whispered to the stars, "for teaching me that strength comes in many forms, and that faith can move mountains, or save them." The mare's hooves clattered over the wooden bridge near home. Hulda saw lamplight in their kitchen window, knowing her father would be waiting with worried eyes. But tonight she carried hope in her heart, knowing that God had provided a way forward through her mother's foresight. She would continue visiting Marco, nurturing the seed of change growing in his heart, and when the moment was right, she would reveal the lease that could save their land. For now, it was enough to know that prayers were being answered, one small miracle at a time. The evening stars emerged one by one as Hulda guided her buggy home, their light reminding her of God's constant presence. Tomorrow would bring another day of challenges, but she faced it with renewed strength, carrying her mother's wisdom and Marco's growing faith like precious gems in her heart. The April morning dawned cold and gray as riders approached the Amish settlement. Through her kitchen window, Hulda watched soldiers in blue uniforms trotting alongside Samuel Pike's buggy. Her hands trembled as she gripped her mother's worn Bible, but she steadied herself with a quiet prayer. Word spread quickly through the valley. Within hours, concerned faces gathered at Elder Matthias Stoltzfus's home. Hulda's father helped her down from their buggy, his weathered face tight with worry. Inside, the large room was crowded with Amish families, their dark clothing a stark contrast to the whitewashed walls. Pike stood before them, his bowler hat held carefully in manicured hands. Behind him, 3 soldiers shifted uncomfortably, their rifles gleaming. "I trust you've had time to consider your position," Pike said smoothly. "The railroad's offer still stands. Fair compensation for your voluntary departure." Elder Stoltzfus cleared his throat. "We have prayed on this matter deeply." "Surely you see reason," Pike pressed. "These soldiers aren't here for show. The railroad's rights are legally binding." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Hulda saw fear in the women's eyes, resignation in the men's slumped shoulders. Her heart pounded as Elder Stoltzfus spoke again. Perhaps it would be wisest to seek new lands," the elder said heavily. "Our ways teach peace, not resistance." "No." The word burst from Hulda before she could stop it. All eyes turned to her, some widening in shock at her boldness. Women did not typically speak in council. Pike's smile turned cold. "I beg your pardon?" Hulda's legs shook, but she forced herself to stand. "We cannot abandon this valley. God led our families here for a purpose." "Hulda," her father whispered, "sit down." But something stronger than fear moved in her now. She thought of Marco in his cell, learning to choose faith over force. If he could change, so could she. "The Bible teaches us to stand firm in faith," Hulda continued, her voice growing stronger. "These lands were granted to us legally. We have worked them, blessed them with our sweat and prayers. To leave would deny God's providence." Elder Stoltzfus frowned. "Child, your heart speaks well, but we must consider the cost. The railroad brings soldiers." "The railroad brings lies," Hulda interrupted, shocking herself with her boldness. "We need not fear them. God has already provided our protection." Pike stepped forward, his boots clicking on the wooden floor. "Young woman, you overstep. This is a matter for men to decide." "This is a matter for truth to decide," Hulda countered. The quiet authority in her voice surprised even her. She saw several elders exchange glances, unused to such conviction from an unmarried woman, especially one they had long dismissed. Sarah Yoder, wizened with age, spoke up from her corner. "Let the girl speak. Sometimes God's wisdom comes from unexpected vessels." Hulda took a deep breath. "We should take this matter to court, present our case before the law." Pike's laugh was sharp. "And what case would that be? Your primitive understanding of legal matters is—" "Our legal claim is sound," Hulda interrupted. "God has preserved the proof, waiting for this moment." The room fell silent. Elder Stoltzfus leaned forward. "What proof?" Hulda's hand steadied as she opened her mother's Bible. "I have found something. But first, I must speak with my intended. These papers concern him too, as my future husband." "Your intended?" Pike scoffed. "You mean the violent mountain man cooling his heels in jail? The one who nearly killed my deputy?" "The one who is learning God's way of peace," Hulda corrected firmly. "I ask for one day. Let me consult with Marco. Then we will present our case properly, through the law." Elder Stoltzfus stroked his beard thoughtfully. "The girl speaks with wisdom beyond her years." He turned to Pike. "We will give our answer tomorrow." Pike's face darkened, but the presence of witnesses stayed his tongue. 24 hours. Then we expect your surrender." He settled his hat precisely and strode out, the soldiers following. The gathered families burst into discussion, but Hulda was already moving. Her father helped her into their buggy, and they rode swiftly toward town through the spring mud. At the jail, Marcos sat reading the Bible she had left him, His eyes lit up at her approach, then narrowed with concern at her expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, standing quickly. Hulda glanced at the deputy dozing nearby, then lowered her voice. "The railroad brought soldiers. Our elders speak of leaving the valley." Marco's hands clenched to the bars. "Cowards, I should—" "No," Hulda cut him off. "This is not a time for fists." She reached into her dress pocket and withdrew the lease papers. "Look." Marco's eyes widened as she explained her discovery. His massive hands trembled as he read the document through the bars. "Your mother, she secured all this? Legally?" "Yes, but Marco, listen to me. I need to know, truly know, that you can support this without violence. These papers must be presented in court properly. If you rage against them, I'll destroy our only chance," he finished softly. The realization seemed to settle into his bones. He was quiet for a long moment, then met her eyes. "I choose faith," he said firmly. "I choose your way. Our people's way. No fists, no threats, just truth before God and law." Hulda studied his face, seeing new lines of wisdom there. "You truly mean this?" "I do." Marco's voice was quiet but certain. "I've been reading about Solomon, how true strength is in wisdom, not war. You've shown me that, Hulda. Every day, your quiet courage teaches me more than all my years of fighting." Tears welled in Hulda's eyes. This was the moment she had prayed for. Marco choosing God's path freely, not from fear or force. "Present the papers," Marco urged. "Stand before them with the same strength you've shown me. I swear by all that's holy, I'll support you with humility, not hatred." "Even when they mock me?" Hulda whispered her deepest fear. "A fat girl presuming to speak of law?" Marco's hand reached through the bars to hover near hers, not quite touching in respect of their customs. "Your size is your strength. Like this valley, you have room for more love, more wisdom, more faith than any of them. Stand tall tomorrow, I'll be praying for you." Hulda tucked the papers carefully away. "Tomorrow, then. I'll speak to Elder Stoltzfus tonight about arranging the court hearing." "Hulda," Marco called as she turned to leave. "Thank you for not giving up on me, for showing me a better way to be strong." She smiled through her tears. God hasn't finished with either of us yet. The ride home was quiet, but Hulda's heart felt lighter despite the weight of tomorrow's task. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks in hues of rose and gold. She touched the precious papers in her pocket, remembering her mother's gentle strength. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight she had witnessed a miracle. A man choosing faith over fury, humility over hatred. Whatever came next, she knew God's hand was guiding them toward something greater than themselves. The valley spread out before her as she rode, the first spring shoots pushing through winter's remnants. Like those tender plants reaching for light, she and Marco were growing toward something new. Tomorrow she would stand before men of power and speak truth with quiet authority. Tonight, she would pray for courage to match Marco's newfound humility. Her father waited at the gate, lantern held high. "Did he understand about the papers?" he asked as he helped her down. "He did more than understand," Hulda replied. "He showed me what grace looks like." Together they walked toward the warm lights of home while overhead the first stars emerged to witness what tomorrow would bring. The courthouse buzzed with whispers as Hulda stepped through its heavy wooden doors. Her plain blue dress and white prayer cap stood in stark contrast to the fine suits of the railroad lawyers, who exchanged smirks at her approach. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her mother's papers, but her chin remained high. "Young woman," the judge peered down from his bench, "you claim these lands were legally granted to your people?" "Yes, Your Honor." Hulda's voice carried clear and strong across the hushed room. "Through my mother's name, recorded and witnessed." The judge's questions came sharp and fast, testing her understanding. Yet Hulda answered each with calm certainty, laying out the lease documents with steady hands. As the judge examined the papers, murmurs rippled through the crowded courthouse. Deputies brought Marco in, chains clinking. Instead of his usual defiance, he bowed his head before the court. "I plead guilty to pride, Your Honor." Marco's deep voice resonated softly, "but not to violence. I have learned that true strength lies in humility." The railroad lawyers shuffled uneasily as the judge studied the lease intently. Finally, he looked up. The lease is valid, the land rights remain with the Yoder family and their Amish community. And as for Mr. Kruger, given his evident remorse, he is hereby released. As the deputies removed Marco's chains, he and Hulda shared a brief, joyful embrace. Their victory was made sweeter by the bond that had grown between them, a bond forged through faith, humility, and unwavering trust in each other. Lantern light spilled from the meeting house windows as the Amish gathered to celebrate. Sweet hymn verses floated on the evening air, joined by the aroma of fresh baked bread and roasted venison. Inside, families crowded the long tables, their faces glowing with relief and joy. Marco stood beside Hulda, his massive frame looking less intimidating in plain clothes. His eyes, once fierce, now held a gentler light. When Elder Matthias called for evening prayers, Marco cleared his throat. "Before we bow our heads," he said, his deep voice carrying across the room, "I must speak." The room fell silent. Hulda touched his arm softly, encouraging him. "I brought shame to this community with my violence," Marco continued. "Pride and anger ruled my heart. I ask your forgiveness, and God's." Elder Matthias's stern face softened with surprise. Other elders nodded, seeing truth in Marco's words. The tension that had haunted their gatherings began to dissolve like spring snow. After the feast, Marco and Hulda walked together toward their cabin. Fresh snow dusted their shoulders, catching the last light of dusk. The cabin stood nearly complete, its new wood glowing golden against the white landscape. "Remember what I said that first night?" Marco asked, his voice rough with emotion. "About 5 sons by spring?" Hulda nodded, her cheeks pink from cold and memory. "I was wrong," he admitted. "All I want now is one lifetime with you. Whatever God gives us will be enough." Tears sparkled in Hulda's eyes as she turned to face him. "In his time," she whispered, "he will bless us as he sees fit. Children or no children, we will have a home, filled with love." Their hands found each other, fingers intertwining without shame. Above them, stars emerged one by one, blessing their newfound understanding. The cabin waited before them, a promise of the life they would build together. Golden lamplight bathed the simple wooden benches of the church, casting warm shadows across rough-hewn walls. The assembled families sat in reverent silence as Hulda stepped through the doorway, her white prayer bonnet framing her glowing face. Marco, standing at the front in traditional Amish black, drew in a sharp breath at the sight of her. The congregation rose as one, and their voices lifted in the ancient hymns that had carried their people through generations. The melodies echoed against the rafters, sweet and pure. Elder Stoltzfus's weathered hands trembled slightly as he raised them in blessing over the couple. Though a few whispers still stirred in the back rows, most faces had softened. Even those who had doubted Marco could see the gentle way he watched Hulda, his usual fierceness mellowed by love. After the ceremony, the community gathered around long tables laden with food. Laughter and conversation filled the air as platters of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and pies were passed hand to hand. Marco, still awkward, but smiling broadly, stood before them all and lifted Hulda's hand in his. The gesture spoke volumes, not of possession, but of respect and devotion. As evening settled over the valley, Marco and Hulda walked arm in arm to their cabin. They carried baskets overflowing with gifts, warm quilts stitched by loving hands, crusty loaves of bread, preserved fruits in glass jars. Their boots crunched through fresh snow, making the first tracks on their shared path home. Inside the cabin, Marco struck a match with trembling fingers. Together they lit their first lamp, its gentle glow spreading across the wooden floors and walls they had built with their own hands. Hulda gazed around at the simple space, the neat cupboards, the clean windows, the carefully made bed. Tears of joy welled in her eyes. After years of feeling lost and unwanted, she had finally found her true home. Heavy snow drifted past the cabin windows that first night, coating the world in pristine white. Inside, warmth bloomed as Marco added another log to the crackling fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls of their new home. Hulda moved with quiet purpose, spreading the colorful quilts they'd received as wedding gifts. Each one told a story, some stitched by her mother years ago, others crafted by neighbors who had finally accepted their union. She smoothed her hand over the intricate patterns, grateful for each stitch. They settled side by side on the bench near the hearth, their fingers intertwined. The wind whistled through the trees outside, but here, in their shelter, peace reigned. Marco's large hand trembled slightly in hers as he cleared his throat. "Dear God," he began, his deep voice unusually soft. "I never dreamed I'd have a family to call my own." His words caught in his throat. "Thank you for giving me this gift, this chance at a real home." Tears streamed down Hulda's cheeks as she listened. "All my life," she whispered, "I believed no one would choose me. But now I know I am beloved. By you, by God, by our community." Together they knelt on the wooden floor. The firelight played across their bowed heads as they prayed, their voices joining in the simple words of gratitude they'd learned to share. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping their cabin in a peaceful blanket of white. As dawn broke the next morning, pale sunlight painted the snow-covered roof in shades of pink and gold. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney, straight and true against the crystal-clear sky. Inside, Marco and Hulda began their first full day as husband and wife, trusting that whatever children God chose to send would come in His perfect timing. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.